This is chapter 1 and the preface of the text that I'm going to be presenting now, and hopefully you all enjoy it. This is the Exploring Leadership chapter 1 and the preface. So just to review, we are looking at just an introductory course in leadership and ethics, and we're going to be focusing on your personal responsibility of ethical leadership through self-analysis, and we will hope that you're able to develop a personal leadership assessment plan and to explore your own values and ethical and moral standing in relation to leadership and leadership behavior. We're looking also for the application of these tools, especially when it comes to ethical decision making. And these are the learning objectives. We'd like you to understand some of the theories that are available in various fields of leadership studies, defend your decisions in using the ethical decision making models that we're going to be looking at, create a plan that applies the concepts of good governance, organize and work with teams in a more effective manner, especially as we go through group development and group dynamics, report on the issues facing our communities and society when we look at leadership issues, and also look at the solutions that you might want to propose for those things. And lastly, we spoke a little about this one before, display and modify behaviors indicative of personal philosophies of positive leadership and ethics. So as I said before, this is one that is relatively difficult to observe and measure, but we hope that we will have some sort of change taking place among individuals when they begin to look at this. So let's start looking at the text that we're going to be utilizing. And as I said before, this is going to be simply the preface area and the chapter 1. So let's begin looking at that. So unit 1 is going to be looking at leadership in the modern world, and what we're looking for is evaluating and examining leadership in our current status. And we would like to try to look at it from a Caribbean perspective and from a local perspective as well. And we need to be examining not only good leaders but also bad leaders, because we can utilize the bad examples that we've seen to give an example of what we don't want. That's primarily what we're going to be looking at there. Now, when we say leadership, what comes to mind when you hear that word? And this is something that you have to think about from your own perspective. Most times when we talk about leadership, images like this come up. We think about leaders like the top row here of political leaders around the world. We have actors, because we see them as leaders in a field. What about when we think about it from a local standpoint? Do we just think about the political leaders that we've had in the past and currently in existence around us? So what is your perception, or what we'll call your paradigm about leadership? Does this reflect some of it? This might be, as I said, because we have preconceived notions of what leadership is, and that is something that is distant from us, and it is not something that we tend to be or want to be involved with, and that's not necessarily going to be something that we will encourage. In fact, we're going to be looking at you becoming the leader and you taking the forefront in leadership decisions. In this particular model that we're looking at, is going to position you in the forefront of the leadership context. So let's start with a definition. The leadership model that we're looking at defines leadership as a relational and ethical process of people together attempting to accomplish positive change. So the key takeout of this definition is that leadership is about relationships, and that is going to be critical to the start of the whole analysis of what we're going to be looking at here. That means that Potentially, we are all leaders. And the only thing that stops us from being leaders is ourselves. And we would want to develop a more positive attitude towards taking leadership actions, even if it were in your small groups and activities that are taking place within your family. These are important for us to understand that we may not perceive ourselves as leaders, but we are in fact potential leaders, or we already have leadership roles, but we don't see ourselves as a leader. So that's something that you want to think about. This is a course that's going to challenge you to become one that understands that leadership is about relationships that you create with the people you work with, and that most importantly, it's not only about you. A lot of leaders we have probably experienced have a very grand sense of self, and everything is about me, me, me. But true leadership is about looking out for other people and being concerned with what they have to do. And that's what the model that we're looking at is going to encourage. So, another myth that we're going to dismiss in this model is that the concept of born leaders and develop the position that leadership is something that can be developed in individuals and any individual for that. So, therefore, leaders can be made. So, there are a number of frameworks that we want to start the analysis with when we talk about leadership. So it's about methods or ways that we've historically looked at leadership from various positions that we have in our studies of leadership. So one of the first is political science. So through the framework of political science, politics addresses leadership as those individuals who have power and use that power to influence others. And that's a very myopic view of it, but the political science is concerned about power and influence. Thus, you'd have people like these gentlemen here, the Premier of China and the President of the United States, who are very um, cognizant of the fact that they hold a great deal of power and therefore a lot of influence in world politics. So this is where we start to see the power and influence element from the political framework looking at leadership. This is again our friend here from the United States and another leader from this is North Korea. And again, it's about images of people who have positional power with a lot of influence, and therefore we look at them as being leaders. These are the G7 2019 summit. These are the leaders of the seven most powerful nations. Well, you're seeing a greater number of them there, but each one of them represent political power from the various countries that they represent. So some that stand out might be, for instance, Mr. Trudeau, who's second from the left, I guess. And next to him, the lady that's standing there is the Chancellor of Germany, Ms. Merkel. And then standing next to Mr. Trump is the past leader of Great Britain, which was Theresa May. So this is a fairly old photograph, but again, it's just representative of the power structure or the political framework through which leadership could be looked at. And of course, political leaders are important because their decisions impact upon the country and people's livelihoods regularly, and they can in fact make or break a nation. So we can see that of course this framework is an important framework to look at. Another framework comes from management studies, and in management what we're looking at is the effectiveness of managers with their relationship with subordinates. So therefore what we're looking at here is management styles and leadership in the management structure that are outcomes driven, because most management is looking for increased production with lower cost so that everything is profit oriented. All right, now that brings to mind this gentleman here, who Steve Jobs, who was an excellent manager and developer, legendary type of leader in Apple. However, he was not necessarily a nice person as a leader, because his goals was in fact to get maximum profits out of his thing and develop his ideas. So some people looked at him as being very egotistical. If you want, you could look at the movie about him, Steve Jobs. This gentleman here, from Facebook, um, he's also positioned as a leader who developed a company from the ground up. But if you look at the movie Social Networking, or Social Network, yeah, I believe that's the name of it. You can see that he's represented in that movie as being a very callous, shallow individual who was primarily interested in, finding out more about a girl he liked. You should look at that movie and probably see an image of him in that. This is another gentleman that recently he's become the world's richest person. He's the first trillionaire, owner and operator of Amazon. And in our COVID situation, his business is seeming to have done quite well. But of course, again, the bottom line for him or these leaders is about profitability. So their measure of their leadership success is measured in terms of how much money they can make. Um, that's a very short-sighted view of what leadership is all about. But as a society, we understand that view, and we measure ourselves towards that. We say, okay, I'd like to be like one of these guys and earn this kind of money and that kind of stuff. Um, the model that we're looking at is not necessarily going to be looking at this type of leadership as being the best type. Another format or framework that we can look at is through anthropology. Anthropology is really a study of the past, and they are looking at the cultural influences such as symbols and norms that influence leadership. So here we're looking from a historical position of leaders, and their society has this symbolism here. So the upside down E represents language. The sphere, which is a stone sphere, represents the artifacts. Of course, the group of individuals represents the society, and of course, the skull would represent the individuals. And from an anthropological perspective, leadership has always been one um, that is reflective of individuals in society becoming leaders generally through their heritage. If you think about kings and queens from an anthropological society, and you can also look at even further back, that strongest individuals or the person who was able to explain things like the witch doctor in a tribe or the medicine man, as in like those individuals would become leaders, and of course the chief would rise from them, usually from strength and combat. So from an well, from historical approach, you can see that leadership has a different structure and a different methodology here that we look at. So that's something that the anthropologists would look at in terms of examining societies from the past. Of course, they look at current society as well, and they would make assessments of our society based upon where our leaders come from and how our leaders develop in various spheres of activity. Another framework that we look at is we look at leadership through history, and this here would really have to speak about people who in our history have risen to leadership positions during significant periods of our time. And this is especially when we're dealing with leading major social movements. So here we have four leaders from a very historic part of our history during World War II. So we have Starting from the left, we have President Roosevelt, the president of the United States. Next to him we have Winston Churchill. He was the Prime Minister of England. Then of course we have Hitler, and then we have Joseph Stalin. These were all leaders during World War II, and their actions led to significant damage to the world. And of course, Stalin was Russia. He represented the Russian thing. And they all played a major role in coming together to get rid of Hitler and what he did during that period. But they became significant leaders during their periods of reign, and they were brought together through World War II. And that is where leaders can rise out of circumstances and history from their own actions, obviously, but history writes them as these prolific leaders that we have. This is another gentleman who rose to significance in the 1960s in the United States in the civil rights movement. This is Dr. Martin Luther King. And we can still see him resonate today in the Black Lives Movement and the current protest action that's taking place in the United States and I must say around the world, where people support the whole concept of Black Lives Matter. So again, from a historical point of view, he is looked upon as being one of those individuals who led the revolution of racial change and dealing with the social injustice that existed in American society and reflected in most societies around the world that were part of the colonization system, which is almost all of us. We can think about that situation here in Trinidad as well. Because this gentleman here, Stokely Carmichael, he was a member of the Black Power movement in Trinidad and Tobago, but he found his roots in the Black Panthers movement in America. And actually, if you want to see more about his story, you can look at the Black Klansman, because he was featured in that movie. So you could look at that and get some interesting insight into his position there. I believe later on in life he changed his name to Kwame Ture, and we know him as that. But again, he is historically linked to the 1960s and the 1970s revolutions that took place both in the States and in Trinidad, in relation to the movement of Black consciousness and the whole concept of making a better space for the ex-slaves at that time. So this was an important element. So historically, these gentlemen have been positioned as great leaders because of the place and the actions that they took in history. Of course, there are different elements that we can look at from that perspective as well. This is another gentleman that most of us are familiar with. This is Nelson Mandela, and he, of course, is synonymous with the destruction of the apartheid system in South Africa. Again, from a historical situation, he positioned himself, not that he wanted to, but he took responsibility and became synonymous with the freedom movement in South Africa, which today is historical aspect of the movement of the African continent in terms of getting away from its past European bondage. So again, historically, these gentlemen have played positional roles in society, leadership roles in society, and it is viewed from the aspect of history. So the other framework we're going to look at is through psychology or sociology, which looks at how individuals and groups operate and interact. So these are two perspectives here that we can look at: a leader and a boss. So you'd notice that the boss is driving everybody up the hill on the left hand side, and a leader coaches people by example. So you'd see that leaders at the head and leading by example to get them up. So this is a psychological perspective, which both individuals might be termed as leaders, but which is the better leader then from a psychological, sociological point of view? All right, that those are things we want to consider. These gentlemen here, on the left, we have Mr. Sigmund Freud. In the middle, we have Karl Marx. And then on the right, we have P.F. Skinner. These gentlemen are sociologists and psychologists and psychiatry who wrote a lot about education and leadership and the role of leaders in society. And they are some of the gentlemen against which we are going to base some of the theory that we're going to be looking at in terms of relational leadership. Now, it might be strange to look at these guys from a psych and soc background, but understand that a lot of what they thought about back in the days when they were writing has helped to shape our thinking into these environments. So something for us to take into position. Of course, these are all guys who are seen as leaders in their field as well. So um, Sigmund Freud in psychiatry, and B.F. Skinner in education, adult education, and of course, well, Karl Marx in relation to um, politics and political thinking. But understand that he was a sociologist to begin with, anthropologist actually, but he wrote in that field. All right, so question, something for you to reflect on. How does your field of study or your field of um, work approach leadership? And more importantly, how do you approach leadership? Those are questions that you need to reflect on and begin to position yourself. So, of the frameworks that we looked at before, where do you see yourself agreeing with or disagreeing with those leadership approaches? And that question becomes more pertinent as we begin to explore the model that we're going to be examining now. So, in looking for leadership, um, this quotation from Zhao, the superficial leader cannot see how things happen, even though the evidence is everywhere. The leader is swept up by drama, sensation, and excitement. All this confusion is blinding, but the leader who returns again and again to awareness of process has a deep sense of how things happen. Now, I pulled this quote out of the same text that we've been reading simply because this proverb speaks to the deep seated need for reflection by leaders and by all of us in any case. And they actually begin to create that distinction between the superficial leader, yes, the superficial leader, and leaders who are of deeper substance. And this brings to mind this question or this photo that I brought up here. Now, this was a G7 meeting, and of course, the central focus is Mr. Trump. And one of the reasons why he's at the focal point of everybody's attention here is because this is where he removed the United States from the Kyoto Convention for the reduction of carbon pollution in the United States. He, of course, views this as a situation where it puts the United States at a deep disadvantage because they have to reduce carbon emissions by X amount by so and so. And of course, the rest of everybody is kind of ganging up on him. But Mr. Trump is the epitome of the superficial leader from my perspective. Other people may not agree, but from my perspective, he's the epitome of a superficial leader who is constantly looking at all of the nonsense going around him, as we talked about before, the swept up by the drama and sensation, the excitement of the things going around him, and is not indicative of a leader who would again return to a sense of self-awareness and reflection. And that is the hallmark of superficial leadership. Those who are looking to just be the center of attention rather than being the center of solutions. And just an observation that I want to, but it starts off the chapter nicely with that. We're, by the way, into the chapter one now. So the framework that the text tries to present is the relational leadership model, and it's based upon a combination of psychological and educational framework that we spoke about from the past with those gentlemen that we looked at. And it starts with you requiring to learn about yourself. That's a very critical element. And needing to be aware of not only learning about yourself, but learning about yourself, self awareness in the context of others. How do people view you? We also need you to look at, and later chapters will deal with these in particular, understanding your personal values, beliefs, and commitment. That has to speak to your ethical and moral standings. So those, again, will be examined later on as well. Now, the leadership development, therefore, requires the development of self awareness. We talked about that self reflection, understanding who I am, where I come from. And we talked about that with the assessment that the self assessment that we have to do, effective listening, collaboration, compromise, and practice. Now, one I want to talk about in a little more detail is effective listening. Effective listening requires something that a lot of us have challenges with, and that has to do with removing, when we listen to other people, your sense of judgment before you hear them. So that a lot of times when we listen to people, we put up our own interference in the communication process by pre-assessing or prejudging what they're talking about. Now, it's nice and easy when you're talking about things that you agree with. But when you start to speak about something that you have a diametrically opposed view towards, what you start to do is you stop listening to the individual in in terms of what their issue or problem might be, but you are listening to them only in the framework that you disagree with them. Let's take, for example, if you are a believer in pro-choice and you're speaking to somebody who's pro-life. This has to do with the position about the legality of abortions. And when these groups of individuals or individuals communicate about these things, I generally believe that there is no effective listening because each person has put up their barriers of where they position themselves with a particular concept before trying to listen to the point that the other individual is trying to to elicit. And that is one of the things that you have to develop as a good leader, is to be able to effectively listen to somebody, especially when what they say or what they have, what their positions are, or what the individual themselves is really something you don't want to hear. Because if you can't listen effectively, then you can't collaborate well. Because collaboration requires that we let people in and do things. And therefore, compromising might be problematic. And the last item there, practice, means that whatever we look at throughout this entire model, we have to put into our day-to-day practice. It's not something that we will learn off like rote, but we have to be practicing these things on a regular basis. The foundation principles of this model, which we will call the Relational Leadership Model or RLM, is that first and foremost, leadership is of concern to everybody. Far too many of us believe that leadership is not for me. That is them people thing. And that unfortunately hands-off approach creates a lot of problems, which is one of the reasons why people say you get the leaders, societies get the leaders they deserve, because if the general thinking is that politics doesn't concern me, then we are going to get political leaders in our situation that will be reflective of the fact that nobody wants to be a leader. And then there are some things that we'll examine in chapter 2 about that. Okay. Another foundation principle is that leadership is viewed and valued differently by everybody from different perspectives. So because they're valued differently and because they're viewed differently, We need to appreciate that. And if we don't appreciate it, then we can't really understand how we need to be acting in relation to somebody who views leadership differently than you do or values it different. Some people see it as being critical, some people see it as being, we could do without that. And that type of thing is something that we have to pay attention to as well. The third foundation principle is that leadership is not static, it has to be flexible. So there are no one style of leadership, no one style of management can work. It must be flexible and deal with the changing environments that we're facing. So it's not something that can be carved in stone and left as one kind of methodology that we want to utilize. It has to be flexible in order to meet the current demands of our society. The fourth principle is different settings call for different styles of leadership. And this is, we just spoke to that in terms of it being dynamic, so that sometimes you might need autocratic leadership styles, other times you might need more democratic styles. And therefore, what this is trying to say is that leadership is not static and it has to evolve and change as required. The fifth principle is that leadership can be learned and developed. So we spoke about that before, about the leaders being born and not made. This model firmly believes that leadership is a learned activity, and that latent leadership that's in everybody can be further developed through training. And the sixth and final principle is that it requires a commitment to the highest ethical standards to encourage change and social responsibility. Now, that is critical. In fact, um, understanding your own ethical values is going to be a critical part of determining this, because in order to have change, positive change, then we need to be holding to high ethical values and standards. And social responsibility speaks to our responsibility as leaders to the society that we belong to, so that we are being cognizant of the fact that we're not operating in a silo by ourselves, but we are operating in a society that requires us to be able to work and be responsible to our society for the actions or inactions that we take or don't take. So, something to think about. All right. So, because it requires that commitment to ethical standards, it requires that we as a leader engage in critical thinking. And that's a problem for a lot of people sometimes, because critical thinking requires removing emotional content and thinking about things from logical, objective point of view, and looking at things from a realistic point of view. It also requires that the individual have credibility, meaning that, you know, for you to be credible, you must say and do. There must be congruity in your behavior and what you say and what you do. You can't do as I say and but not as I do, kind of thing. And a lot of our leaders in today's environment suffer from credibility issues. Authenticity is talking about being truthful and being honest. Same thing with integrity. You notice these words are critical. Being in having integrity is the only thing that people have, and your integrity, authenticity, and credibility can be shattered by, you know, doing things in secret. And when it's exposed, all of these things come crashing down, and it then speaks to your ethical behavior. Again, ethical behavior is it becomes evident through action more than what you say. And it's again an element of analysis that you're going to have to go through to look at your own ethical values and standards. All right, so what are the developmental principles that the model looks at? It starts first off with the knowing stage. You must get to know yourself. We talked about that, self-analysis. You must understand and know how change takes place, and change in self, change in others, change in organizations. So we need a wide understanding of change and change management. and how and why others view things differently than you do. Now, that's one that requires again that you suspend your judgment, because if you only think through things from your own perspective and your own influences, then you're not going to be able to understand why somebody else thinks differently to you. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with their position, but you must understand why they've arrived at where they are. Okay. Now, again, we have to remember not everything that we're talking about here is something that is black and white. There are lots of gray areas that we're talking about here. But knowing how to arrive at understanding is the critical element here. So it's not just about understanding yourself, understanding how change occurs, but you also have to be able to learn to understand why people behave the way they do and why they see things the way they do. And that's critical. That's a very important process, and it's sometimes the stumbling block that for most leaders, because they have a perception of how things should be, and if you think differently, they have serious problems with you, and they don't make the effort to understand why you think that way or why somebody else thinks in that manner. The second element, well, this actually is an exercise in perception. So if you look at these three photos here, is actually speaking to the same thing, understanding. Perception is a funny thing because in the upper right left hand corner there we have a picture, and there are two elements there. You may have come across this before. There's an image of a woman looking over her shoulder, looking backward over her shoulder, a young lady. And there's embedded in that image a second image of a older lady looking down. Let's see how many of y'all can see that. When you view this, maybe you could give a report back to us. The the image on the bottom is much easier to work out. Is it a bunny or is it a duck? And then the third image of the gentleman sailing into an island, and both of them talking about I'm saved. So understand the bittersweet meaning of perception and reality. What's the perception there and what's the reality of either of them really saving each other? Because it doesn't appear that way. The man is stranded on an island all by himself. The other gentleman is stranded on a boat floating around the place. Like I says, a boat is a raft. But as he approaches, one sees it as salvation and the other sees it as salvation. But the reality from a third perspective is that neither of them are going to be saved because they're both going to end up on the island by themselves. Who knows? I think others view things differently from you. That's the perspective. Understand why they're thinking from that perspective. And that's important for us to, as a small exercise to get that going. All right. So the second aspect of the development process is the being part. So once you get past the understanding part, the next part is being. You must be ethical, principled, open, caring, and inclusive. Now, ethical, we talked about a bit. Principled is related to ethical um, concepts. Open and caring and inclusive, those are important. Open means, again, suspending your judgment of others and being open to varying points of view. That's a difficult one. But moving from just being open to being open and caring. So maybe you don't like homosexuals. And therefore, if you're not open to that, and somebody who is an open gay individual will come to you with an issue or problem, and you will not care because you're not open to their perception and their lifestyle choice. But as a result of that, you don't care that that individual is in pain or has a problem. And once you can't be open and you can't be caring, there is no way you can become inclusive. But that's what the being element asks you to be. Yes, you're ethical and principled, but you have to be open to other positions or points of views, and you have to care about those individuals, regardless of the fact that you may not agree with them, because they have to be included in your drive forward as a leader. Okay, so that brings us to this gentleman here, who, from all reports, has been probably one of the best business leaders to operate in the various businesses that he's run. And this quotation from him is very apt for the discussion that we're having. Having a personality of caring about people is important. You can't be a good leader unless you generally like people. That is how you bring out the best in them. And that's exactly what we've been talking about: being open and caring, regardless of them being different to you or thinking differently to you. Being open leads to being caring, and therefore leads to being inclusive. And then only when you can do that, you can then bring out the best in individuals. That's his position, and it's reflective of that particular second stage of the developmental process. So the third level now would be, we started knowing, then we did being, now we have the doing, which is the practical aspect. You must act in a socially responsible way, consistently and congruently, as a participant in a community, and on your commitments and passions. So this is the part of us acting what we say. This is the walk the talk aspect of the leadership process. So the element here is consistently and congruently. It means that you must consistently behave in that manner at all times, and your behavior must be content in all levels of activities or all areas of your life, not just in your private life or in public life. So in public life and private life, you have to be the same. Action must be congruent. You can't treat strangers better than you treat your family, and you can't treat your family better than you're treating a stranger. And that's part of the problem, especially if you are participating in a community, and that community is dependent upon you for leadership. And you must act on your commitments and your passions. What are you passionate about? What are you committed to? Those are questions that you need to do. But the doing part is the critical part. All right. So moving along. So as an example of the doing part, think about organizations that are espousing the concept of corporate social responsibility. Now that's a huge thing. Most corporations are trying to be responsible to the society in which they act, because in essence, a lot of organizations are very parasitic in nature. They set up business, you purchase goods and services from them, and they simply seem to be making money out of the population. But what do they give back to our society in relation to how they contribute to our development, how they contribute to our well-being, and even something like um, our environment? So those are things that's the doing part. A lot of corporations talk about being corporately socially responsible, but do they actually do it? I mean, you be the measure. We are all part of the same society. Look at the organizations around us and look at what they talk about in terms of being socially responsible, and which corporations do you see as being the type that gives this type of concept, this principle, um, veracity in society around us? Is it true that they are really socially responsible? All right, so just an example of the doing aspect in practice. All right, so leadership can't be reduced to a number of easy steps, and that is quite true. It's not a step-by-step process. A lot of times we have identified three stages of three things that we have to do, but there's no way you can take that entire thing and drill it down to this step-by-step process. But what it does do, it sets up a way of us perceiving things, and therefore helps us to develop our personal philosophies of leadership and work out the core values that help make us good leaders. And it's a process that we're going to be going through, but it's not a step-by-step process. This is the part that I talked about in terms of you developing a leadership plan and marrying that to your self-assessment. Those are elements that you have to pay attention to when you're looking at this. So the developmental process is not step by step, because understanding yourself may take a lot longer than you think, and then of course understanding others and so on, and then working out your own positions of ethical values and such can also deal with that. But take a long time to do, or may take some serious reflection to get done. So, but once you can start to identify those core values that help you work with others, then you can start to put those things into practice. All right. So one of the things in the developmental process is that we've been taught in our past lives by the leaders and teachers that we've had that we have to work hard to get things done. And the leadership process thinks a little beyond just hard work. Yes, it's hard work, but it's not complex enough to deal with the situations that we are faced with. So they suggest instead of working harder, we need to work smarter. And they've identified three areas of smartness or smarter activity: collectively smarter, reflectively smarter, and spiritually smarter. Let's examine those. So, collectively smarter is very simple. Collectively, we are all smarter than just one of us. That's why this statement here: all of us are smarter than one of us. And that's important because it is the foundation of group work. Group work requires that we recognize that there's strength in numbers. And for some people, they can't let go of the I part. And that is a challenge. But to work better, we have to remember that more can get done from a group of individuals working closely together with agreement and goals than just one person trying to work all by themselves. And it should be no surprise to you during this time of COVID that we seem to be socially isolated from each other. And we may feel as if we are just the one of us, but really and truly, if we understand how to work collectively as a group, even through this difficult stage, um, it means that we will be better off for it. So collectively smarter is a good way to work smarter or work harder by using more individuals to help shape concepts to help get work done. Second one, reflectively smarter. Taking time to make meaning of what is happening in order to gain perspective and understanding. And this is one that we tend to lapse on. I mean, when's the last time that any of you took time to reflect on your past activities? Let's consider, for example, did you get enough time to reflect on what happened last semester before we started this semester? Or did everything just crash one into the next with all the activities going on? I know from my perspective, I know I didn't have a lot of time to reflect on what took place in the transition last semester to the transition this semester because we were inundated with a lot of activities in between the two semesters, and it 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 it's not the best thing for me. I should have been able to spend some time and think about what I did before I moved forward because it would probably make the processes that I use now moving forward better if I took time to understand what took place in the past and put some meaning to what had happened in order to gain some better perspective of how to move forward in this current circumstance. So understand reflectively smarter sounds good, but not necessarily an easy thing to do. Then we talk about spiritually smarter, and here we're not really talking about religion and that type of stuff, but being spiritually smarter really talks about being aware of the values and beliefs that you have as an individual and the principles that you hold to, especially when things get bad. So when things get bad, what do you do? Do you cut corners? Do you cheat? When things get bad, what do you do? That's what I'm talking about. What are those values and belief structures that sit inside you that make you behave in a particular way, regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in? That is the critical element that we have to pay attention to. And there's no better way to find out what drives somebody, what principles sit in somebody, than when they're going through a rough time. And when they are going through rough times, this is going to be an important thing for you to be paying attention to. You need to be aware of it. Spiritually smarter means being aware of what drives you and understanding that that has an impact upon how you behave when things don't go your way. And is there a difference? When things are all nice and hunky dory, do you behave in one way? But when things go bad, do you start getting a different behavior coming out of it? That's what we're talking about here. There's be congruent behavior between when things are good and when things are bad. Because when things go bad, you start to behave differently. Then somebody's going to say, "Wait, all the stuff this person was saying before, it is all a flam, that kind of stuff." So you want to think about it from that perspective and understand. But again, spiritually smarter means being aware of that and whether or not your principles are actually correct or not, all right, or relevant or not. Okay, so what's a paradigm? So a paradigm is a way in which we look at things. We tend to, as human beings, we tend to try to put patterns and systems in place to make sense of it. And the paradigms that exist, for example, the paradigm of classes, of school. School used to be, you know, come into class on an evening, into a classroom with other people and sitting down and socializing with your friends in the classroom or your classmates, and then the lecturer comes in and starts to lecture. That paradigm has changed, and therefore, if you don't change that paradigm or change with that paradigm shift, then you're going to create some problems. So the question coming out here is, what is your current leadership paradigm? What do you believe is good leadership? And that is a paradigm you want to examine at this point. So when we have problems, we obviously need to make changes, and that actually signals a paradigm shifting. So obviously, for example, in our situation that I just talked about with classes, we had a problem, and therefore that problem needed a different way to approach it. And that's what signaled that paradigm shift in the way in which we do teaching. Now, a lot of lecturers in the past did not like the online environment. I myself um, have some concerns about it, but I mean, there is nothing I can do about getting back into a face-to-face situation because I don't have the capacity to contribute to getting a vaccine for the virus, so that we can feel safer coming back out and meeting with each other on face-to-face situations. But that paradigm shift had to occur in everybody, and that's a great example of having to shift from what we previously held as our common belief structures and stepping out of what we are comfortable with into what we're no longer comfortable with or what we're uncomfortable with, to build a new pattern or new approach to looking at things. And that's a great example of paradigm shifting. And this paradigm shift that we're talking about here, specifically in the text here, they're referring to the paradigm shift required for us to change our perception of what leadership is all about. So this is a paradigm shift here that the text talks to, that leadership is not something about what something a leader possesses so much as a process involving followership. And what is followership? Followership in the text is really leadership in action among people in groups. So followership starts to talk about, you could be a leader, but you have nobody in your group, then what you leading? That's the whole point. the people in your group, we refer to them as followers, and therefore followership is as critical and as important as the leader himself or herself. All right. So there are different follower types. You have the politician, the partner, the subordinate, the contributor. Now, on the X and Y axis, we're measuring, on the Y axis, we're measuring the relational initiative or relationship initiative. And on the X axis, we're measuring the performance initiative. So you'd realize that the individual that you might like to be as a follower, think of yourself as a follower in a small group, would be the partner, where your actions or your performance is at a high level, and your capacity to develop great and productive relationships is also high. So that's a partnership level. But we don't all fall into that one category. There are other categories. You might have somebody who is high on the performance area but low on the relational. We have people like that in groups. They are quite good on doing research and getting information and stuff like that, but they're not good with working with other people. There are a couple of people that you might come across like that. And then, of course, you have the politician. They're very good with developing relationships and talking to people, but they're really poor on performance. So they could talk a lot, but they can't really do much. But there's a role for that person. And then, of course, you have the individual who's smack bam in the corner, the subordinate. They they really have problems with relationship initiatives, and they have very low performance capacity, subordinates. Now, if you're a leader in a situation like this, and you understand that these people fall into these different categories, you have to be able to say, okay, well, maybe I could use a politician for one set of activity. Let's say you're marketing something, and so he's not going to do the work to develop the marketing plan and whatnot. You're going to go to a contributor who might be able to develop the plan and so on, and pass it over to the politician to sell it. Making sense? And of course, the partner now might be able to work with subordinates by giving them delegated responsibility in small areas that they could perform in and prepare work for everybody else to be able to utilize. So, again, strategically knowing where people fall into the follower types that exist here, at least in this model, you can understand them better to be able to use them to the advantage of the entire organization or the group. Now, the problem, however, is that partners have a tendency to challenge leaders, and that's not a bad thing as long as you can understand that the dynamic between the leader and each one of these individuals as followers is going to be slightly different. You can't behave to a subordinate the way you behave to a partner. That's not going to work. You might be able to, for example, use a more authoritarian type leadership style with a subordinate, but that authoritative style cannot work with a partner. You might have to use a more democratic style with that individual. So you have to be careful with what you're doing in terms of dealing with your follower types. But just simply identifying the different types of followers that are there helps you to start to work better with the individuals with whom you're going to work. Because remember, leadership is this relationship you have with other people, and you're all focused on executing some kind of plan, executing some change. Remember that. That's a relational definition of what is leadership. All right, so this is another um, breakdown of different types of leaders, or sorry, followers. So you have the loyalist, the sycophant, the critic, the opportunist, the spectator, the traitor, and the realist. So this is another assessment that you can utilize. So leaders need to be aware that they may have among them people who are sycophants. Now, sycophant is somebody who's only there because they can get something. So they're only there because you have something that can help them. Um, and they are like parasitic in nature because they are going to utilize you to get whatever they want. Loyalists, on the other hand, are those people who are diehard loyals to you. Dangerous type of people because they have a tendency to be sheep-like because they will agree with you even if you make a mistake. The realists are those people who will follow you, but they will call you out on your errors. Traitors would be people who they're there only to siphon information out of you to feed somebody who may be competing with that leader. Spectators, they're just there to gape, basically. They're not doing anything, they're not taking anything, they're just watching. And of course, opportunists, as opposed to psychopaths, are going to be there to try and take use you for an opportunity to get something else. Maybe an opportunist might want to usurp you as the leader. That's the opportunity that they're looking for. And of course, you have the critics who are simply there only to criticize. Now, although this is a nice little model, it doesn't mean that followers fall into these things neatly. So some people cross boundaries. So you might have a traitor and a sycophant simultaneous, right? You might have a loyalist who's also an opportunist, so you, or a spectator. So you might have that kind of overlap or intersection taking place with the different types. So this is a little more complicated as opposed to the four stage model we looked at before. Okay. All right. So as a follower, and we can always think of ourselves as followers because we've been in organizations and group activities where we didn't take a leadership position. These are the responsibilities of the followers: offer support to the leader, take initiative, play counselor and coaching roles to the leader, raise issues and concerns when necessary. Some leaders don't like that because they don't like to know when they're not doing things correctly. Seek and encourage honest feedback. That's an important one. That means you're not a sheep. You're not just, the multitude that's following. Clarify your rules and expectations. Show appreciation. That's an important thing. I mean, leaders tend to show appreciation to followers, but the followers show appreciation to leaders sometimes. But there's a give and take with that. Keeping the leaders informed. That's an important element because an informed leader means for better preparation and better leadership and better decision making, and the ability to resist inappropriate influences of the leader. And that's important to remember because a lot of leaders find themselves in a situation where they are in positions of power, especially charismatic leaders, and they have bad behavior or they have bad influences and they are influencing people to try to do something. Think about Hitler. Not everybody agreed with Hitler and his hatred for other races and religions, and especially the Jews. But nobody resisted him because this follower model probably didn't exist back at that point in time. But how many of us just go along and we don't say anything about the behavior of a leader? That's a critical thing. Followers have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to hold our leaders up to scrutiny, and bring them to task for when they're doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. And that's important because we keep our leaders honest, and that's important. Okay, so these are important in terms of follower responsibilities. Then we have the follower competencies, and they're kind of related to the to the responsibilities. So let's look at their competencies, their capacities to do things. They have to be able to display loyalty. They must be able to function well in change-oriented environments. Of course, they must be able to function well on teams and groups. They need to think independently and critically. That's one that current leaders may not necessarily like, because thinking independently and critically means that they can make decisions outside of what you might like, and therefore you might force you to defend your position when they question your decisions or thinking processes and stuff like that. And then, of course, the one that's really important, it considers integrity of paramount importance. The integrity, both of themselves and of the leader, needs to be critical in terms of their ideas. It's not that, hey, he could get away with this here, that's thing happening at home. No, it can't work that way. Integrity is something that is the same in private life and public life. It's a consistent set of values that you hold throughout and in all of your activities. That's what integrity is all about. Okay. So the idea is the word follower the best way to describe these persons? Maybe we have different terms we could utilize to measure them. Um, uh, one term that comes up here is team players or an associate. Those are a couple of things that's come up. These are some different types of followers as well that was brought up in a different model. The alienated follower, that's persons who so if you look at the axes, you think you have independent and critical thinking measured on the well, the level of critical and independent thinking measured on the y-axis going up and down, and on the x-axis from the negative to the positive, you have passive behavior to active behavior. So you have the alienated follower, who is a highly critical, independent individual, but is passive in their behavior, and they would simply be disaffected individuals in the group who are capable of independent thought and critical thinking, but are passive in their behavior. We're familiar, I've used this term here already, sheep. They can't think or haven't developed critical thinking, and they are passive in their behavior. That's sheep. That's the dangerous kind because they have no backbone. They can't stand up to a leader and stop them from doing things. And then, of course, you have on the opposite side of them, you have the yes people. They are unable to develop critical thinking, or they have very little, but they're very active in their behavior in the group. And that means that what happens in that sense is that you have people willing to do the things that you want to get done without thinking about it. That's the yes man kind of thing. And then, of course, you have the effective follower, somebody who's active and critical thinking. And that's the kind of follower that we want. Think about this from a political standpoint. Where do our political um, parties position themselves in terms of their followers? Are they sheep? Are they yes people? Are they alienated? Are they effective? And which ones does the leader encourage? I would say we want to encourage effective followers, but effective followers are harder to manage. That's an important element that we want to talk about there. Uh, Good leadership does not necessarily mean that it's going to be an easy boat because you have to defend yourself against effective people, effective followers. Something to think about when it comes to followership. All right, so now we're getting into the leadership styles that can be utilized. You have the classical view, which is the laissez-faire, autocratic, passive, participative. Those are the classical views of X and Y type leader. For those of you who've done management studies, you know the X and the Y leader style. That's the autocratic versus the participative democratic type. Um, and then, of course, you have the laissez-faire, which is a model where just leave it alone and everything will work itself out. We know that will happen. All right. Then you have the situational leader, leaders that emerge in situations only in that situation, like in an organization, they're only there. Then you have an emergent leader, that's somebody who is in a lower level in an organization, if you think about it from an organizational standpoint, and they are beginning to emerge in that organization as a potential leader. So they emerge out of a massive individuals or followers and eventually become a leader. A transactional leader is, or leadership style is one where you're always dealing. So if I give you this, you'll get that. We tend to do that with children a lot, to get them to do things. You say, okay, if you do this, I'll give you that. Transactional, and that kind of works with some leadership styles as well. You don't need do certain things if you get a reward for it. Transformational leaders or leadership style is one is a lot more um, it requires a lot more effort on the part of the leader because that leader requires selling concepts and ideas. It's especially important for people who to look into this transformational style when they're dealing with change management in organizations becomes very critical. Of course, the visionary is a very special type of leader. That's somebody who's going to sell to you something that doesn't exist, a pie in the sky, a vision. And that type of leadership requires a whole different set of tools than any of the others. So each of the six leadership styles is a different set of tools. And this is what we're talking about in terms of leadership being dynamic. In different circumstances, you may need to rely on different types of leadership styles, and that's going to be important. So situational could be like you come across an emergency activity, and given the situation, you take leadership because maybe you have the requisite skills to deal with that emergency. That's situational. Emergent is one that is a more gradual leadership movement, whereas transactional is direct, bargaining status. President Trump thinks himself a very transactional leader, so something to think about. But when we talk about visionary and transformative, those are higher level types of difficulty in terms of leadership styles. Some things to think about there. So, who's a leader? That's any person who engages with others to accomplish change. And the change can be small, it could be grand, it doesn't matter. But any person who actively engages with other people to change something is characterized in this model as a leader. What is the purpose of leadership? Purpose of leadership, especially from an organizational point of view, is to motivate employees, attain organizational goals, ensure rules are adhered to, provide continuity and momentum, embrace and foster change, look after the common good, and be socially responsible, civic engagement, or engage in civic engagement, and lead with social civic responsibility. So some of these we need to kind of break up. The others are fairly straightforward. Embracing and foster change, common good. When you are a leader, you have to look at the common good of everybody, as a whole, not necessarily as the individuals of your organization or your group, but you have to look at the common good for everybody. So let's look a little bit at what social responsibility is. That's a personal commitment to the well-being of people, our shared rule, and the public good. So that means being socially responsible for not just yourself and your small circle of family, let's say, but the whole environment or society that you're living in. Consider, for example, cleaning the drains in front of your house. That's socially responsible. Looking after the bushes in front of your area, putting out your garbage, making sure it's not scattering on the road. Those are activities that are rife with social responsibility. Those are things that we're talking about. Of course, from a leadership perspective, you're looking at other grander activities that can start from simple things like that. Looking after your front yard and having a sense of social responsibility, because what I do affects society. So, follow the rules, that kind of stuff. Civic engagement. That is a sense of heightened sense of responsibility for all communities. Your work, your social community, your family community, and your general community as well. Well, what we call a community. Your working circle, your social circles, your family circles, and your community. We are responsible in all of them for everybody. And that a good leader will engage in that civic engagement and understand that it is important that I engage with those individuals. I don't only engage with my work people, but I and my social and family, but I have to look at the community I live in and the community I work in and that kind of stuff, and being responsible in and for all those communities, making sure, like for example, right now we have this mask law. Civic engagement here would be responsible for all my communities by following the rules about wearing my mask wherever I go outside in public. That's important. That's civic engagement, engaging in the rules that our society has put up in order to safeguard everybody against the virus. Those are things that will speak to that. So these are some constructs of civil engagement: civic action, civic commitment, and duty. So look at some of the things that they're asking you. Civic action: participating in activities such as volunteering and service learning. Um, like, beach cleanups, that's one that you could look at as civic action. Civic commitment and duty, or the willingness to make positive contributions to society, to our society. What do you do on a regular basis that is adding to the values, the positive values of your society? All right, civic skills: the ability to be involved in civil society, politics, and democracy. Simple things like voting and participating in public discussions about policies that government is coming up with, and having discussions with them. Um, that type of stuff. That leaders must encourage this type of activity. All right, social cohesion, a sense of reciprocity, trust, and bonding with others. So when you get involved with community groups, how many of you all are members of little church groups and stuff like that? Um, that social cohesion that we're talking about, there's when you're in that group, people have to give and take, and there must be trust with each other when we're dealing with that. So those are things that you want to look at in terms of civic engagement. Let's look at civic responsibility: a sense of personal responsibility individuals should feel to uphold their obligations as part of any community. What are the things that we must be doing to be able to be civic, um, to show a sense of civic responsibility? These are some of the things that we talk about. Citizens have duties and responsibilities. For example, following the law. How many of us speed when we shouldn't be speeding? Ducking jury duty, going to school, obeying laws, paying taxes. Those are our duties. What are our responsibilities? An action that a citizen should take: should engage in community service. We should vote. Serving in the military, displaying patriotism. Those are responsibilities and actions that we talk about. And they don't require big activities, but small things, not seen by a lot, but you following your civic responsibilities. All right, those are things that they refer to when we talk about that. And good leaders and leadership encourages this type of activity. So, an important question here as we move into the learning environment is: should the leader know everything? And the answer to that question is no. Nobody can know everything about everything. That's just stupid. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders don't like to see themselves from the perspective of, I don't know. Trinidadians in general tend to be that way, if I find. You ask somebody for directions and they always give you something, even if they don't know. Very funny that way. But the expectation that a lot of the older leaders is that you can't show weakness by not knowing something. And that is unfortunately what has led to a lot of problems in the past. What a leader needs to understand is more than just not knowing everything. The leader requires openness to learning. That's the most critical thing. If you pretend that you know everything, you're not going to be open to learning. And just remember again, all of us are smarter than one of us. The whole concept here is that if you're open to learning, then there's no expectation that you will know everything. Of course, you need to have some, qualifications and capacity, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be learning, knowing everything up front. But if you're open to learning, it means that when you don't know, other people, the other people in your group, can help you to come to a better understanding of it. And that's a critical element that we need to pay attention to. So remember, the whole group, including the leader, needs to make sure that when you're working in an environment, that it is open to learning, making mistakes, and sharing knowledge. Now, there are organizations that operate, they may be open to learning, but you can't make mistakes. and sharing knowledge is not something that is respected. Sharing knowledge is actually seen as a sign of I know better than you. If I know everything, I have more power than you, and that's an important concept because knowledge is power, and that knowledge, if you don't share it, doesn't empower other people. So if as a leader you are, you just amalgamate all this power and all this information and you keep it to yourself and you don't share it, then you're not going to envision this type of environment. So a good leader, the leader that we're looking at in this model, is open to learning and sharing. And in the opening and sharing element, they have to allow for themselves making errors or for people within their group to make errors as well because we learn from the mistakes that we make, and that's the most important thing. Making mistakes is not the end of the world. Of course, in certain disciplines making a mistake can be more dangerous than others, but making mistakes means that we have to be able to deal with that situation and learn from it. That's the most important thing, learning from our mistakes. But of course, maintaining that environment of learning. All right, so this is a learning model that is presented in the text in terms of the method or the way in which we learn and the process that's involved. So the three spheres that we're looking at there is your focus, your capability, and your will. Now, the intersection of your focus, your will, and your capabilities is what you actually can do. If you're focused and you're willing, that intersection there is what you'd like to do, what you want to do. Your intersection of your will and your capability is what you could do, but you're probably not doing. And then your capacity intersecting with your focus is what you can do. But you require, at the end of the day, all three to be able to act: your focus, your will, and your capacity. If you only have two out of the three, you can't do things. And that's what the learning model talks about. And that's why it requires that we develop our capacity, help to hone our focus, and develop the will to be able to get all three to work with each other. So a simple learning model there that you could look at and understand a little bit more about the whole learning process and the need for organizations and for leaders to encourage this type of activity. All right, to take somebody who may want to do something to do it means you have to give them capacity. So if you only have people who have focus and will, but they have no capability, then you have to engage in providing that for them. But if they have capability and focus, they can do it, but they're not willing to do it. You have to motivate them to do it. You understand what I'm talking about? That whole learning model speaks to what leaders and followers need to focus on and able to get to the do stage as opposed to want to do, can do, could do. All right. We want to move out of those stages and get to the do point. All right. So the most effective organizations that exist learning environments in which learning is ongoing, constant, pervasive, and valued. We talk about that in COSTAT. We talk about lifelong learning. Through learning, we stay vital and renewed. And that's a constant thing. I mean, I'm learning so much more now that about being online, learning different types of tools and so on, and developing my skills here. Of course, I am making mistakes. I'm probably making mistakes this minute, but as long as I keep on trying and I don't give up, I I am going to be a lifelong learner. That's an important aspect and concept that leaders and leadership and followers need to understand that life is about learning. Even when you die, you learn some very important lessons when you die too. You learn what happens on the other side. All right. Now, one of the organizations that comes to mind about a great learning environment from an international standpoint is Google. Google has developed this whole concept of learning while on the job. So they've developed a lot of activities in their organization to host this learning environment and this constant learning and growing. So much so that they've become this very one of those places that everybody wants to go and to work at because of that type of effective organizational learning community. Now, COSTAT is a learning community, and the idea would be, are we providing the environment that helps us with this ongoing, constant, pervasive, valued learning, lifelong learning? That's important. Good. Maybe you could give us some feedback on that. Give it to me and I can pass it on. Who knows? Um, are we doing a good enough job to encourage communities and organization of lifelong learning? That's important. All right. Moving on. One important area of learning is experiential learning. A lot of us learn simply from what we do. So the way in which we come to any kind of new information is by dealing with it from a concrete experience. Another way is through abstract conceptualization. So there are two ways in which we come to knowledge: from an experience or from thinking about it. Abstract conceptualization. That's what it is. Thinking about something is called abstract conceptualization. That's an important thing. Now, when that process is reflected upon, that either the concrete action or the previous one, the abstract conceptualization, when we reflect upon that, then we start to be able to apply it to a new situation. So something happens. So there's a model here that brings it. Something happens, a concrete experience. We reflect on it, about the observation, then you start to think about a different way to do it. You try it, that becomes then an active experimentation. That becomes a concrete experience, and we run through that process again. Consider, for example, every time you write a paper. Every time you write a paper and submit it for assessment, that's a concrete experience. But did you reflect on it? Did you rethink it, which is think it over, conceptualize it, through abstract conceptualization, and then try a different method. So this is experiential learning, learning through doing, learning from our experiences. That's an important area of learning because, trust me, for those of you who have more years at work and so on, you would understand that experiential learning is superior learning to just learning out of a textbook. Once we can make our learning more reality based or based in the real world, then we'll have a better experience altogether. That's a critical thing that we want to pay attention to. All right, so an important aspect about the learning model is the importance of learning, and that's why you have this section on learning here that's taking place, both from the learning environment, lifelong learning, and experiential learning, because a lot of us have to learn while working, and especially when it comes to leadership activities. So you have to encourage it to be able to earn the benefits from that type of learning behavior. So this is an interesting quote that I found coming near the end of the text, which is of the chapter, I should say. Leadership is a role to anyone, a role open to anyone. Leadership is living by a personal set of rules in which you motivate others to do the right things, be engaged in the world, and to listen to others and their concerns. Leadership is focused on the other person. And I found this to be quite, the student's name in the quotation here is Chandra Johnson. And I found this was very important because it's speaking to the fact that this model is trying to say to you that everybody is potentially a leader. And we can set our personal values up and motivate people to do the right things. Engage with people by listening to them and what they are all about, their concerns, and focus on the other person. Because in essence, leadership is about always going to be focused on the other person. And I thought this was an apt um, quotation to pull from the text because it speaks to what the whole model is all about. Now, these are some keys to leadership effectiveness. As a leader and participant in our communities, we should be and expect others to be purposeful. So as a leader in the relational model, we expect that when we communicate or we deal with other people, that they are purposeful, that they know what they're doing, and they have a reason for doing it, that they are inclusive, that we are trying to include everybody, that leaders and individuals within our groups empower each other. So again, this is about the sharing of knowledge and information. By empowering other people, giving them opportunities to be able to do things, being ethical, both as a follower and as a leader, being ethical in our behavior, and of course being process oriented. Process oriented means that simply we are following processes so that we can, repeat what we've done before. Because if we just do it in an ad hoc manner, we may not be able to duplicate what we've done. But if we set up a process of doing things, then we can repeat that performance over and over again. And of course, process oriented means that we can change the process, upgrade the process, and learn where the process is falling apart. Those are important elements that we expect that as leaders and participants, we behave in this manner. These aspects of relational leadership are foundational to work smarter, and that is relationship there. We have to be able to work together and work for what matters. Examine your role in these communities. So, for those of us who are, disengaged from our communities, this is one of the things that you probably want to start to look at. And the communities are varied. You have your work community, you have your study community, you have your lineman community, and all of them have different activities taking place. But one of the communities that we tend to ignore a lot is the community we live in, and it's one that we could probably look at, maybe getting more involved with, because there's a sense in a lot of individuals and a lot of our communities, there's a great lack of community involvement, which is something that is necessary for us to move our society forward. So what's happening in the real world? So the RLM here is the abbreviation of the relational leadership model. So this model seems to be idealistic and unrealistic. And obviously, what we're talking about in this model, we don't really see being practiced. And as a result, that leads to confusion between what we think we want, the ideal, and what actually takes place. And Festinger, sorry, identified this as cognitive dissonance. Now, that's something that occurs a lot in people, and they may not understand. It's a not only confusing, it's a very uncomfortable feeling. Cognitive dissonance is when you know you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, cognitive dissonance, um, and you feel very uncomfortable doing it or uncomfortable experiencing what you're seeing. And that's something that we have to pay attention to, because that cognitive dissonance means something is wrong. And if something is wrong and we do nothing about it, that cognitive dissonance will not diminish. It will get worse. And maybe if you're working in an organization where that's happening too much, you will want to leave that organization, or you will not be happy in it at all. If you live in a country where there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, I mean, there are serious issues, and that causes a lot of fallout in society when there is high levels of cognitive dissonance taking place between what is expected and what actually happens. That creates a lot of problems. It's something that I've observed, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, where the United States talks about this great dream and the possibility for everybody to become the very best, but yet still there's a huge gap between what they say and what we see happening in their community, especially when it comes to the equity of those opportunities for everybody in society. And you wonder why that society is experiencing such grief and breakdown at this point in time. Maybe it's because the level of cognitive distance has gotten to a point where is it's made people fed up, and they want change. They want the system to change from the way it is into the way it should be. Jesse. All right, so comparing things in the real world again. So why are we continuing to push this? Why are we continuing to try to sell a philosophy here that or leadership style or method of thinking that doesn't seem to be common practice? Because the whole point about this is we're trying to create hope, and it's not when all right. So the idea is that even when things are not what they ought to be, we can still try to force a philosophy of trying to change. And that's the thing that they talk about, being the change you want to see. That's the basis of this, trying to practice the the leadership that we're talking about here so that it becomes the reality that you want. And it's important that we still encourage you to want to do this because it will help us to move our society forward into areas of being, more, you know, more realistic, more people oriented, and us being more comfortable with the way things should be, as opposed to what they really are at this point in time. And that is a challenge that we have to face. So it's not nearly enough to teach students, and this is why from academics, this is one of the reasons why we continue doing this. And the great quote is, it is not nearly enough to teach students how the world is. We must also encourage them to think about how it ought to be. Without some hope for a better world, it is all too easy to think only of oneself, and all too easy to leave the responsibility of citizenship to others. And that is something that is endemic in Trinidad and Tobago. This level of apathy that we have when we see things go wrong and we say we like it so, or that's how it is. It's always that way. It's not true. It didn't get this way that by having that kind of attitude, that by us doing something, and we have to encourage this change and this type of thinking, and not just be hands off. And that's unfortunate because we have that situation a lot here. We have communities that nobody feels as if they're responsible for it. And that means that nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole, or I am in the community and it's not my problem. That those kind of dismissive attitudes are not going to be it's not what the model is encouraging. So as you can see here, community is not someone else's responsibility. It is a commitment from each participant. Leadership is not someone else's responsibility, it is a shared responsibility of all of us. As a participant, leadership is your responsibility. In this course, leadership is your responsibility and mine. Okay? And even if I'm not the leader and I'm a follower, it is still my responsibility to hold the leader or leadership responsible to the rest of us. Far too long we've been giving leaders with bad practice leeway to do all kind of things, but it's not what should be happening. A lot of our leaders don't like when followers get up and tell them things, and that is something we have to stop. Just allowing this apathy to continue. So the real world is problematic to place a model like this because it leads to even more cognitive dissonance, and that's something that we have to try and get reduced. All right, so we kind of wrapping up here, and I just have a couple of quotations here. Everybody can be a leader, but we have to remember that leadership is not about position. It is not about power. It's not about following someone. It's not about causing fear. It's not about giving orders. All of us can be leaders, and leadership is a process that we can learn. This is the citation for the current content. All the images that I use, or I got all from Google Images, much to already put in here. And I'd like to leave you with this. Leadership is not the privilege of the few. You and I can be and should be leaders. All right, guys. I know this was pretty long. but the chapter is really intense, and I encourage you to read it and try and grab from it some of the concepts that I've discussed with you. I'll have to load in separate videos the other the other chapters as we go along. So get started with this and start to see how it goes. All right.